Hello, Group 3. This is your video for the Week 14 context readings on bilingualism. So your reading in Group 3 was quite short. It was about multilingual acquisition. So starting on page 126, excuse me. So basically, multilingualism refers to speaking 3 or more languages. And in many contexts, children learn a third language. So for example, Malaysian child will use Malay with her friends during playtime and in some lessons, but will use English during science and math class, and use Arabic when practicing to read the Quran, right? And in African countries, it's quite common as well as on the Indian subcontinent. Because what happens is children will use a vernacular language at home or a local language at home, and an official regional language at school, and finally an international or global language around age 10 in school. Zaire is a good example of this. Children learn a local vernacular at home, and then they'll know Lingala or Kikongo, some regional official languages, and then study French as a foreign language starting in secondary school. So how is it different from bilingualism? According to Seno's 2000, it presents more diversity and more complexity, with different possible acquisition orders among the 3 languages. And there's more variation within each individual about which language might become dominant, what processes of transfer take place, and what eventual proficiency levels are achieved. That's from Seno's and Genesee 1998. Something I'll add here, when they say what processes of transfer will take place, well, if you use L1 in your local community, your local vernacular language, but you're highly proficient in L2 because you learned it early, then when you're picking up L3, yes, you could have transfer from your first language, but you're also highly likely to have transfer from your second language. And sometimes that's what we do, right? Kind of racking our brains for the word, for the thing, and sometimes the other language we learned will come out. That's natural, but what processes of transfer, how that's going to happen, in what order, it's just depends on the individual for some of these things. So bilinguals enjoy advantages as opposed to monolinguals when it comes to learning a third language. This makes sense, right? The more experience you have with learning language, the easier it is to pick up a new one. I mean, you might see similarities with your second language, or concepts that are grammatical concepts that exist in your L2. You now see it in L3. That's going to help you out, of course. Things like perceptual discrimination. Perceptual discrimination, so how they determine between perceptions of things, whether that's a grammatical expression of perception, or listening comprehension, of course, is going to be better. And in Klein 1995, bilinguals have an advantage in lexical and syntactic learning measures by means of grammaticality, judgment, and correction tasks. I wanted to break this down for you too. Lexical and syntactic learning. That refers to lexical lexis, so vocabulary, collocations, anything. It could be synonyms, antonyms, basically words. And syntactic learning, remember, syntax is like sentence level grammar. Syntax is things like word order and things like the structure of a sentence, right? So I can say for myself that for me, Korean syntax was not that challenging because there are a lot of similarities with my L2. There are a lot of similarities with Russian. So when you're talking about word order being a little different from English, yeah, I get that, but experience with another language is going to make that concept easier for me, right? And a grammaticality judgment task. Grammaticality judgment tasks are used in this kind of research. Basically what they do is they say, okay, they show you different sentences and you have to mark which one's grammatically accurate and which one isn't. So it's your own kind of perception of grammaticality. And so if you understand a language well, if you know their grammar well, if you know their syntax well, you should be able to say which of 3 sentences is accurate in standard English or Korean or whatever, right? And correction tasks, that's pretty clear. They give them wrong sentences and say, fix the grammar, fix the syntax. Going back to Cummins, remember, Cummins in the last group is talking about cognitive demands and linguistic demands. So ideas and language is 2 separate things to think about. There's a positive and significant relationship between L1 development and L2 development. A similar relationship is likely to hold true for a third language. In a study specifically focused on the effect of the third language, compared the linguistic competence of children in Catalan, Spanish, and English. Remember, Catalan is a minority language in Spain. They gave them a series of language tests at ages 10, 12, and 17. The hypothesis was that high levels of competence in L1 and L2 would correlate with high levels of competence in L3. And guess what? It was indeed confirmed in all 3 languages. So that's kind of confirming what we believe. Similarly, in the Basque country, which you've probably read about, Basque is a language that is nothing like Spanish, nothing like French, nothing like Portuguese, but the Basque countries where this language is spoken, part of which is in Spain, right? In Spanish Basque bilingual programs, Lascabaster found that learning an L2 or an L3 did not have any negative effects on the development of L1. Whether L1 was Spanish or Basque, and that balanced bilinguals were able to take advantage of their bilingualism in relation to learning a third language, i.e. English. So having access to that 2 languages, it's going to give you advantages. This research supports that. If you're a Basque speaker, here's an example of how that might work. If you're a Basque speaker, your language is not even Indo-European, right? It's not related to Spanish. It's not related to English. But if you're a balanced bilingual in Basque and Spanish, well, English is going to get easier for the simple reason that English is much more closely related to Spanish than it is to Basque. So your knowledge of that L2 is really going to help your L3. Okay. Nation and McLaughlin and Nyack et al. Found that multilinguals demonstrated greater flexibility in switching strategies for rule discoveries tasks And this superiority was explained by their experience as language learners. Switching strategies for rule discovery tasks. What that sounds like to me is that it's some kind of inductive task they have them do. They expose them to a number of examples of a new grammar, for example, in use, and they have to determine the rule for themselves. Well, they switch between strategies pretty well because of their experience as language learners, right? If that's your first time doing a language task, you're probably not going to have many strategies, right? And then Lasagabaster reported that bilinguals learning a third language had a more highly developed meta-linguistic awareness than monolinguals. When the languages are more similar, there is evidence for transfer. Typological similarity seems to be more important for determining transfer as compared to which language is the speaker's L2 or L1. Listen to that. Typological similarity seems to be more important for determining transfer. So according to this study, again, going back to my example, or even a better example, let's say a really closely related languages like, say, Spanish and Portuguese, or Spanish and Italian. If I know some Spanish and I'm learning Italian, I'm more likely to transfer my Spanish when I'm trying to speak Italian because of the typological similarity. Even though English is my mother tongue, I'm not going to try to plug in an English word there when the Spanish word might seem more appropriate, might be where I'm inclined to go. And also the highlighted part, a more highly developed meta-linguistic awareness. So you know about meta-linguistic awareness from theory class or CDT. That's basically knowing about language. It's not knowing another language, but it's knowing what a verb is, it's knowing what present perfect is, it's knowing these facts about language and grammar. Well, if you have experience as a language learner, then obviously that's going to be something that you'll have a higher meta-linguistic awareness than someone who knows one language. There's a lot of good examples here. From these contexts, you have Munoz was the Catalan-Spanish bilingual children learning English in Spain. And what that showed is that so they're immersed in Catalan in preschool. Remember, Catalan is another minority language in Spain. And they start Spanish alongside Catalan in primary school. At the age of 8, the first foreign language, English, is introduced for 2.5 hours a week. English is introduced as a timetabled subject, and children have no access to it outside school. Later, at the age of 10, they could learn a second language, which is often French. So that's one context. There's another one here which is interesting, the South African context. So 28 local languages in South Africa, with 11 officially recognized languages. That's 11 languages that are official languages within South Africa. Afrikaans is one of the most widely spoken national languages. Afrikaans is very similar to the Dutch language. It was the language of one of the groups of colonizers that came to South Africa. And English enjoys a privileged status as a language of political, economic, and intellectual power. English is, many South Africans speak English, right? And there are many South Africans who don't use Afrikaans. So there are white South Africans that also use English, and there are white South Africans that use Afrikaans, and there are black South Africans that use Afrikaans or English or any number of local languages. English enjoys a privileged status as a language of blah blah blah. Most children whose L1 is not a national language will be immersed in an L2 as soon as they start school. However, parents want their children to learn English above all, and as a result, some children may switch to English immersion by grade 3, age 8. Primary English teachers often do not speak the children's L1, which makes the language shift very difficult. Yeah, so imagine that. Imagine that. English with this privileged status, or English with this international status. Sometimes English is seen as a way out of certain places. It's seen as a way to succeed through immigration and in certain places. I can give you an example from my own life. In 2004, I was working in one of my very first teaching jobs in Eastern Europe, in the country of Estonia. And in Estonia, of course, the national language is Estonian, which is actually related to Finnish, which I mentioned earlier in a previous video. So and also Hungarian, right? So but Estonia was also part of the Soviet Union for many years, so there's a large population of Russian speakers there as well. Okay, so you have, within Estonia, you have Estonian speakers and Russian speakers, right? And often the Russians do not speak Estonian, but the Estonians, particularly the older ones and the educated younger ones, that speak Russian as well. Now, I worked at a language school that was where many local Russians would go to this language school. And the language that was in the highest demand was not Estonian, so they could, have a better life in the context of Estonia. The language that was in the highest demand was English. Right? It's kind of, oh, this is going to help me to succeed somewhere else, or I don't know what everybody's rationale was. And at the time, interesting point here, at the time, many of those Russian speakers, ethnic Russians, were born in Estonia, but they did not have Estonian citizenship, because there was a law that said just because you're born there doesn't make you a citizen until you pass the Estonian language test. Can you imagine? And so you would think, with all those conditions the way they were, you would think that the ethnic Russians would study Estonian, but no, they were in my class studying English. Don't ask me. All right, and then of course Luxembourgish, French, German in Luxembourg. Luxembourg is a very small country, and Luxembourgish is has a very small number of speakers, but they have their own trilingualism. The native language is Luxembourgish for most kids. French is the language of power and prestige, and German is the language of convenience. So children speak Luxembourgish at home and in preschool. In primary school, they're taught both German and French. German is introduced as a subject in the first grade of primary school in 8 to 9 periods a week. And in the second half of second grade, progressively, French comes in later. And by secondary school, French becomes the medium of instruction. So they switch completely over to French. Most pupils also learn English. It's not uncommon for an individual in Luxembourg to speak 4 or 5 languages. The model enjoys the support of the population, although it is acknowledged that the burden on primary children may be too high with progressive language switches. You know, I feel like children are capable of a lot, but maybe not 4 or 5 languages. And all right, that was the video for group number 3. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the classroom.